Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode on food systems transformation. I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Puspa Sharma, Senior Visiting Research Fellow here at ISAS. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, Saeed.
In today's episode, we will be talking about issues around food systems. Food systems are essentially the networks needed to produce and transform food and ensure it reaches consumers. And I will let Dr. Puspa delve into this more during our conversation. But we are seeing how global food systems face increasing pressures from challenges such as volatile climate, geopolitics, and rising costs. And food security continues to be a major global challenge. Around 40% of arable land globally is degraded. A third of all the produced food is either wasted or lost, and in this process, close to 2 billion people in the world lack regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. This is also true for South Asia, where, according to the FAO, the United Nations body on food and agriculture, food security is low for over 40% of the total population in the region, and undernourishment remains very much prevalent. Challenges such as these demand urgent action in transforming the systems and policies around food. And there has been movement on this where technologies are being deployed, there is policy innovation, and greater collaboration. And this is what our conversation will touch on today. So before we begin to talk about food system transformation, perhaps it will be useful for our listeners to understand what food systems are. So can you tell us what is a food system and what constitutes the system?
Thank you, Saeed. Indeed, I think it's important for us to understand what a food system is. But to put it simply, food system actually is the whole, spectrum. I think you also said it very well in the introduction. It's whole spectrum from pre-production of food to, consumption, or even beyond that, even like disposal of food waste. So when we say pre-production or say the production of food, we talk about the inputs, right? That takes into consideration several things. So in this whole spectrum, the activities that we see and the actors that we see would be considered as part of the whole food system. Typically, we understand food system more in the context of production, but it's not only production. We also have to take into consideration the aspects after production, such as supply, the distribution, where the whole thing of the wholesale market, the retail markets, right? The consumption patterns, the dietary preferences of people, all these things constitute the food system. Or in another way, if you look at it, you can also look at it in the way of, say, like there is the agriculture system, which is the most important part, I would say, of the food system. But then we also look at the markets because food agriculture today is not the same as before, like centuries ago, where like people used to grow their own food and have it for themselves. But now food has become more of a commodity. So markets also become very important part of the food system. So that's how we have to look at the food system.
Thank you for giving us that context for this conversation. And before we actually move into transformations, perhaps we can try to understand what a food system transformation would want to achieve. So perhaps in the context of South Asia, what do you think the end goal of a food system transformation would be?
As I said, when we say food system, there are a lot of components in it. So when we are talking of food system transformation again, that could constitute transformation of one of these components or many of these components, right? If you look at South Asia or even like globally in terms of food system transformation, what has happened is food system transformation has not taken place because of someone's effort as such at different times. By that, what I mean is, as I said also earlier, that there have been changes in agricultural systems, there have been changes in people's, employment practices, which have had a change in the food system overall. So these transformations have taken place for several reasons, like urbanization, the dietary changes, people's preferences, right? So when we talk about food system transformation today, it again calls into the picture several kinds of transformation. But one particular kind that perhaps you also alluded to in the introduction is that food system as a whole has become a major, victim of climate change. And it has also been contributing to climate change. And the way that agricultural systems have been changed, have been transformed earlier, particularly because of the changes we saw due to, like, say, the Green Revolution, and there's a whole controversy on that, for and against that, have perhaps also now led to this idea of bringing about transformation in the food system, because largely it is being seen that the current food system is not sustainable. And so there has to be ways of making it sustainable, making it more resilient, more equitable, more inclusive. So the food system transformation today is perhaps more about making the whole system sustainable in the sense of environmental or climate sustainability. But there are also many different aspects of food system transformation that would come in the picture even when we are talking of this environmental or climate sustainability in the food system.
Mm-hmm. Right. Sustainability becomes an important element in this entire conversation. And so it's not just about the equitable distribution of food and how it's produced, but also in a more forward-thinking manner, how it has to be climate sensitive and sensitive to issues like global warming. So I want to move to the how part of this transformation. How do we undertake this transformation? And you mentioned these keywords, words like resilient and sustainable. So how do we move towards making food systems resilient and sustainable?
That is a complex, actually, question, and difficult to answer, actually, because the food system in itself is very complex, right? As I alluded to about the Green Revolution earlier, let's take the Green Revolution. In the 60s and 70s, with rising population and the famines that we saw in different parts of the world, including in India, Green Revolution was hailed as the solution to what was being seen at that time. And indeed, the Green Revolution helped a lot in terms of rising yields, in terms of making people food secure in one sense, right? But then there have also been controversies about the kind of agricultural system that it propagated, with the kind of seeds that were used, very thirsty kind, which needs lots of water, lots of pesticides, herbicides, and all these kinds of the use of more water, use of pesticides, herbicides have turned the whole agriculture system into quite unsustainable kind. And so there's now the idea is about reverting back in some sense. But you will not find the same kind of thought and the same kind of ideas about the sustainability with all different kinds of stakeholders, whether it's South Asia or anywhere. Let's take the example of the recent, the farmers' protests in India after the new farm laws. There have been effectively two sides to this whole protest and the farm laws, where one group saying that this is good for the farmers, but the farmers have not been understanding it. The other side saying this is against the farmers because this is about giving more control to the corporate sector. So this shows the complexity of the system itself, right? And the other example you can say is, like during COP28, there was a declaration on the food system itself, in the sense that because the agriculture sector is a major contributor to climate change, steps are necessary to make changes in the agricultural system. But perhaps that's a very difficult path to take for India at the moment, with a huge population still dependent on agriculture, small farmers, small farm holdings, and therefore the kind of agricultural practices that are being undertaken in India cannot be changed overnight or very soon in a short period of time. Perhaps that was the reason why India has not signed on to that declaration, right? So what this shows is that there is so much of complexity given the people engaged in the sector, which is a livelihood for millions of people in South Asia, right? So what is the way forward is, as I said, is a very difficult question. Where the difficulty arises is when we are talking of the conventional in the sense the traditional kind of the agricultural practices, which is considered to be more environment friendly, it is said that that system does not produce enough food as the modern kind of a system that we have accepted produces. So the challenge over here is it really the case that the traditional system doesn't produce, is not able to produce enough food? Or have we not looked deeper into it? Have we not looked into the technologies behind it? Can there be more research and development into those practices, into those native kind of seed varieties, which are more resilient? Because it is said that the native varieties are more resilient than modern ones because they are more adapted to the surrounding, to the environment. So is it that more R&D into those kind of practices help in terms of increasing the yield and at the same time also contributing less to the damages that the current agriculture is doing? So that kind of debate perhaps is a bit missing, and that is where the focus has to be, so that the stakeholders can at least have a common ground or a middle ground about where to take the current practices forward. Without that in place at the moment, perhaps this controversy is going to stay, and your question is going to be a difficult one, a complex one, perhaps difficult to find a single answer to about what the food transformation would look like in the coming days.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was a fairly broad spectrum of things to deal with that in that situation. But I do want to come back to government policies. You did allude to that, and I would probably bring in the example of Nepal, which has a food systems transformation strategic plan for between the years 2022 and 2030. And a focus within this strategic plan is on localization of food systems. Perhaps you can shed light on how that intersects with the current challenges that Nepal's food system faces, and if you want to comment on other countries in South Asia as well in that context.
Sure, Saeed. That's a very important question. As far as I'm aware, I think this is not a strategic plan as such that is there, but there have been references to this as a strategic plan. I'm not aware that there is a strategic plan, but there is a report on this topic that you just said, and that is based on the workshops that were organized in Nepal at the central level and at provincial levels. I think there were 10 workshops or so, and that was in the context of the UN Food Summit, UN World Food Summit. But this document does discuss the challenges and also some of the way forward in terms of Nepal's food system's trajectory in the days ahead. One very important aspect of this document is it talks about, Nepal's constitutional mandate of providing this right to food sovereignty to every Nepali citizen as the basis of where Nepal sees its food systems going forward. Now, food sovereignty is actually it's said to be a very progressive kind of an idea. And very few countries, especially in Latin America actually, where actually this whole movement in food sovereignty, the social movement also started. And very few countries over there have accepted this and legalized it in the constitution, or there are some legal arrangements. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia has accepted this as not legally, but food sovereignty as an idea has been accepted. In Nepal, if you look at the whole of Asia, actually not only South Asia, is the only country that I am aware of which has, kept the right to food sovereignty as a constitutional right, as a fundamental right in the constitution. And the document that you said earlier says that this is the basis. And to operationalize this fundamental right to food sovereignty, there is this law on right to food and food sovereignty in Nepal. And recently, they have also come out with the regulations. Now, what does food sovereignty mean? Perhaps we have to look at the whole idea of food sovereignty to understand what Nepal aspires to, take this food system forward based on the idea of food sovereignty. As an idea, I think I find food sovereignty idea to be a bit, again, ambiguous, I would say, because there's not much clarity. Although some of the things that the food sovereignty movement talks about is again agroecological way of things. It's the same thing as saying that the whole damage that has been done to agriculture, the soil, water and everything because of the kind of modern agriculture we have taken forward, and that is largely because agriculture has been industrialized. It is no more as a way of life, but agriculture has become a commodity. It has been industrialized. And the big powerhouses, big corporate houses have been into the agricultural sector. So to reclaim agriculture back from all these kinds of, the developments that have taken place in the name of modern agriculture, the idea of food sovereignty has come forward. Although how to do it is again complex and there are ambiguities around that. So when you have taken this idea as the basis, which itself is not very clear, then operationalizing it becomes difficult. And that is what we are seeing in Nepal as well. Localization, yes, it does talk about the role of the central government, of the provincial government, and of the local governments about what to do, how to take it forward. But broadly, the idea of food security and agricultural development in Nepal, it's still about the way that the smallholder agriculture has not been functioning well. It's still more the subsistence kind that has not made Nepal's agriculture competitive. So it has to go on a larger scale, perhaps in an industrial way, has been the broad idea which doesn't sit well with the whole idea of food sovereignty. Actually, if you look at the practices that are there, largely, it is already of the kind of food sovereignty, but that is what the larger stakeholders' idea has been to overturn that. So on one side, your ideas are against the whole idea of food sovereignty as being taken forward by the food sovereignty movement, but then institutionalizing food sovereignty as a fundamental right and trying to operationalize it is not going to go well. And that is what I have found in this document as well. There are a lot of contradictions, perhaps because of this, whole complex issues about what to do, whether you want to take it in a smaller form as a way of life, connected to people at the local level, and whether you can have people connect with agriculture in that particular way when there are no returns. And that is what we are already seeing, right? Large number of youth have been leaving agriculture. Why? Because there is no return from agriculture. And because there is no job available in other sectors also, they have been moving abroad. Migration has been taking place, and that's one reason behind that. So the idea of what to do with agriculture in terms of livelihood, in terms of income, in terms of food security, and in terms of the climate and environment has become very complex. You get hundreds of documents of these kinds, but if you have a deeper look into them, you will find lots of ambiguities, lots of contradictions, and there is not a single way forward about how to take it. And that is where perhaps we need a deeper and a closer interaction discussion with the stakeholders who are engaged in the whole system, farmers being the main ones to be put at the center. But when we say that again, it's difficult because farmers are not a homogeneous kind. There are larger farmers, there are smaller farmers, their interest diverse, right? Their ideas diverse. The way that they practice agriculture is very different. So how do you bring all these things on board and have a common understanding, or at least, as I said earlier, an understanding in the middle ground? And then perhaps only when you have that, you will be able to realize what has gone wrong, what is to be done right, how to do it right, and then perhaps you can have things in place to implement it forward. Otherwise, it's all about talking, having those ideas, writing it down, but difficult to implement.
I think that was a very interesting answer, and you raised some very interesting points. And just for my own understanding, one of the things that food sovereignty as a concept. Now, you mentioned that it exists within like within the politics of Latin American countries, which seems consistent with the kind of politics that we see in that region. So, just for my own understanding, within Nepal, did this emerge from a grassroots level social movement? Because you posed it as this idea which goes against a modern, industrious, commercial agriculture. So, did this emerge from a social movement, or how did this emerge in Nepali politics?
That's interesting. I did have a look at that. Actually, I did some research on that as well. And the trajectory of having food sovereignty in Nepal did not emerge from the grassroots social movement. Actually, many people at the grassroots level wouldn't even understand what food sovereignty is. And if you look at the way Nepal's agriculture is, as I said, it's not in a very large scale. You don't find so much of an industrial kind of concentration, corporate kind of a control in Nepal's agriculture. It's largely small scale. And the policymakers are actually trying to raise this small-scale agriculture to a large-scale agriculture, which is against the idea. So how did this come about? It was, again, I would say, political. It was kind of it's not policy transfer as such, but it was a transfer of this idea from the social movements by some of the political actors in the country. And when you say food sovereignty, it sounds so good politically, right? Who wouldn't want to be food sovereign? The sovereignty, the word sovereignty politically itself is so attractive. And when you talk of food sovereignty, it's attractive for everyone. So in the context of the political change that Nepal was going through, in 2015 we had a new constitution. I think food sovereignty was an idea that need not be understood in depth, but it had an appeal that attracted all the political actors actually across the whole spectrum of Nepal's politics to have it in the constitution. But if you look at what food sovereignty movement actually came up with, and even in the case of Latin America, there was a paper that I came across very recently. A research done in Ecuador found that even the indigenous farming community in Ecuador loves modern agriculture. And they are practicing modern agriculture. Why? Because they said that this is the kind of agriculture that is giving me the returns. I don't get returns from the traditional kind of practice that we used to do. So this paper has raised the question, who does the food sovereignty movement actually speak for? It's not even those indigenous farmers. You see, the complexity is visible even from there. But without understanding these complexities in all this thing, We have it in our constitution. We have, like Nepal has it in the constitution and in the legal frameworks, but then not knowing what to do about it.
All right. Thank you for walking us through those complexities and contradictions. But I think I'll come to my last question because a conversation on food system transformation without talking about technology innovation would probably be incomplete. If a sustainable and equitable food future will naturally see a collaboration within diverse stakeholders, and technology here is likely to play a key part. So within South Asia, what kind of progress have we seen in leveraging technology for this transformation in food systems?
Yeah, see, when we talk of technology, it's not only the kind that generally comes in mind. What I mean by that is, you see, like the modern seeds are also technologies. That technological development, right? The modern seed varieties that had been developed and that are being developed. So when we talk about the Green Revolution, it was the technology at that time which made the Green Revolution successful, right? So today, if we are to revert and if we are to take a different path, then of course technologies perhaps will have a big role to play. Some of the technologies have been introduced in South Asia. Say, for example, like the precision agriculture, the use of drones, the general and the typical kind of technology that we think of have been there. The question is again, who is using them? Perhaps not the small farmers who won't be able to afford those kind of technologies. Perhaps the middle and the large scale farmers might be using those technologies. And sometimes what happens is, although you develop and adopt technologies in a good sense that it would help, you will also face some downsides to it. A very recent, not recent, but an example that we can very well understand is about the use of solar pumps. Like in India, subsidies that are provided to farmers for electricity, for irrigation, has been a huge and a controversial topic, right? The use of fossil fuels to generate electricity, or use of fossil fuels, that are used, the subsidies that are provided, that's a burden on the government exchequer. All these things had been there. So the use of solar technology to pump water was a very positive kind of a development, and that was being used. But what happened was that once you adopt the solar technology to pump water, there is a one-time fixed cost, and the farmers who are able to do that have installed that. But then there's no running cost as such. And when there is no running cost, what happens is you extract more water. And when it is being used by the large-scale farmers with enormous amount of land, now you are irrigating even more fields which perhaps you might not doing earlier, because now there is free water. Because of that, studies have found that there have been, water tables have been going down, aquifers are being lost. So what is happening is a new technology is adopted to reduce fossil fuel and then help the environment, but on the other side you are getting these negative effects. So how do you bring about a balance in terms of regulating the use of that pumped water, controlling that pumped water? That's an example of how to make use of technology better, right? So technology always doesn't mean that it will only help. There are downsides to it as well. But definitely, as I alluded to earlier, if we are talking about giving up on the kind of green revolution technologies that have been of very that have had a very bad effect on agriculture. And if you are to go into the conventional forms, the traditional kind, adopting traditional kind of agriculture in the way it was is not going to help. There has to be investment in research and development, perhaps in improving the varieties, those native varieties, in coming up with the technologies that is suitable to take forward that kind of agriculture, which also gives higher yield, because that is very important in today's world, right? You need to have enough food for the people. So rather than thinking about the specific kind of technology that might help the current form of agriculture, if the idea is to change the whole pattern of agriculture, I think the focus has to be on research and development, and more investment, more money is needed over there to understand what is necessary, what is the way forward. And then you can perhaps think of the particular technologies that would be helpful in that regard.
Right. So I think we have to be mindful of the complexities and contradictions in this domain as well.
Exactly.
So perhaps that's an important takeaway from this podcast, that these conversations are very important to have had for policymakers when thinking about this. But Dr. Puspa, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your very insightful answers. I'm sure our listeners will find them helpful to understand these issues. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Saeed. It was a pleasure.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.